Well, good evening. Thank you for coming. And this evening I'm presenting with Nicolle of Sugar Feather Farm and we'll be talking about salmonella and backyard chickens. So most people have heard of salmonella typically in classes that I teach or in surveys that different organizations have done. We see that upwards of 90% of people have heard of salmonella. And this is in part because it's a really big problem in the US. The CDC estimates that there are more than 1 million cases of salmonella per year in the United States. This is not the actual number of people who go to the doctor and get it confirmed. This is an estimate of the total number of cases, which is thought to be substantially higher than the number of people who actually get a confirmed diagnosis from a doctor. Because there are so many cases of salmonella each year, we do see about 300 deaths per year from salmonella. The salmonella itself is not very deadly. It only has about a 0.5% mortality rate, so your odds of dying of salmonella are really low, unless you are elderly and already quite sick. However, roughly 20% of salmonellosis cases are hospitalized, usually due to dehydration, because salmonella is like the world's worst case of stomach flu in many cases. If you can't keep fluids down or inside of you, you're likely to be hospitalized, especially if you're elderly or a small child. Because salmonella is so prevalent and because 20% of cases are hospitalized and because some people die, it is the most expensive foodborne pathogen in the US and is estimated to cost about $3 billion per year, not even including the cost of foods that have to be recalled when they are found to contain salmonella. Chickens are commonly associated with salmonella, both from the perspective of chicken meat and eggs. However, live chickens are also a problem for salmonella because they can carry salmonella long-term and without having any symptoms. And then they shed the salmonella in their feces and can infect other birds in the flock or potentially their owner. One of the ways that they cause illness is that chickens are really fond of dust bathing. It's their equivalent of a dry shampoo. And they're not overly picky about where they bathe. So it's not uncommon that they'll dust bathe in areas they previously pooped in once the poop is dried. And salmonella survives pretty well in dried chicken poop. So they then have salmonella all over their feathers. And so if their owners have their chickens up near their face, they can acquire salmonella as well. Unfortunately for humans and our attempts to control salmonella, there are a lot of types of salmonella. In fact, there are about 2,500 different types of salmonella, and there are 20 that are estimated to cause about 80% of all illness. In this chart on the right, you can see the 20 most common types of salmonella in 2016. There normally is new data every year, but thanks to COVID, the CDC has been a little backlogged. So hopefully we'll get some new data soon. But enteritis is commonly associated with eggs and typhimurium with chickens or chicken meat, and these tend to be the most common types of salmonella. However, there are many, many others. So for instance, in the backyard chicken associated outbreaks in the last 2 years, we do see enteritis and typhimurium, but we also see Hadar and Indiana and Infantis and Madanka and Munchin. And yes, many of these types of salmonella are named after cities or countries, probably where they were first discovered. So in general, we'll see Hadar and Infantis and Salmonella enteritis and Salmonella typhimurium almost every year, but then the additional serovars or types of salmonella vary a lot. One of the reasons we worry about salmonella and eggs from chickens is because of the anatomy of the chicken. So chickens have only one outflow for all substances they excrete. So they lay eggs and they poop out of the same hole. And not only does this mean that eggs then potentially come out contaminated with residual fecal matter, which you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell by eye because salmonella doesn't have a particular color and it's not visible to the naked eye. But salmonella can also travel back up from the cloaca into the oviduct, the uterus, the shell gland, and infect the egg prior to it being laid. So you can actually have salmonella on the inside of the egg, and it can transmit that way from the mother to the baby. So the main reason that I started looking at salmonella in backyard chickens is due to the data from the CDC. So since the CDC first started tracking data on salmonella and chickens in 2011 in a systematic manner, we've seen an explosion of cases of salmonellosis. In 2020, the highest number of cases ever recorded were recorded with about 1,800 people confirmed to have acquired salmonella through exposure to live poultry. However, because salmonella often doesn't cause a super severe form of illness and people may think they have the stomach flu, it's estimated that true number is almost 30 times higher, or closer to 30,000 people getting salmonellosis in 2020. Last year, it looks like things get slightly better, but this is probably not a completely accurate number. For instance, Vermont didn't track any cases of backyard chicken-associated salmonellosis. All of their investigators were dedicated to COVID tracing. And I suspect Vermont is not the only case that way. So if we had complete data for last year, I suspect that we would actually see a number closer to the number for 2020. So around 1,800 confirmed cases. And so over time, we see this rise, and it's not just that chickens are getting more popular, we're getting better at tracking this, and we're getting into owners that maybe have less experience with livestock. So we have to think about how people get sick, and if you know and love poultry, it actually is pretty easy to figure out. There are a lot of pictures on the internet of kids kissing chickens. There are family pictures of me kissing a chicken as a kid. But if you think about it, if the chicken is dust bathing in dirt that contains dried feces, and then you kiss the chicken, you're potentially getting dried feces on your mouth. And if that chicken has salmonella, or one of the other chickens in the flock has salmonella, that's now in your mouth. And because salmonella infects people primarily through eating things, if you get salmonella in your mouth, that now has direct entry to your stomach and your intestines, where it will thrive and cause illness. So it's actually a fairly dangerous practice. Another thing that's definitely become somewhat of a problem is that a lot of people, when they get chickens, get them partially as pets. And while people will kiss and cuddle farm animals as well, it's more common with pets. So you actually see higher levels of these kinds of behaviors that put owners at risk, especially in chickens that are maybe in town and owned by people who haven't had livestock before. Another factor that comes in here is setups. You know, baby chicks have to be kept warm. And so a lot of times they end up in people's houses. And a garage or a basement is fine, but if the chickens are in your kitchen, that's suboptimal, or your bedroom, both from a dander perspective and the dust and the easy access any children in the house have to them. So like a bathroom is a better option if you don't have a garage or a basement. You can put them in, just because then you're not potentially getting chick dust and dander all over your dishes. or in your bedroom. And a previous study by the CDC, authored by Basler and a number of other people, found that almost half of chicken owners do keep their poultry indoors at least part of the time. That's without even going into the segment of the population that actually has chickens as indoor pets, which is a thing.
Andrea, we have some questions.
Yeah.
So what would be on the previous slide? You can go back.
Yep.
It says poor setups for chicks. Can you go into that, or are you going to go into that later?
I can go into that now. So an ideal setup for chicks is to have them away from your main living area. So a room you maybe don't use regularly, that's easy to clean. You want to have them in a box or a bin with high sides so they can't escape. You want to make sure they have a source of heat, so maybe a heat lamp. And you want to make sure that it's easy and convenient for you to clean their water and their feed containers without using your kitchen sink. Because again, you don't really want chicken poop in your kitchen sink, both from a gross standpoint, and if there's salmonella in that chicken poop, it's now in your kitchen sink and it can get on your dishes and or your fruits and vegetables that you're about to wash.
Right, just like raw chicken practices.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, in case you weren't aware, washing your raw chicken is also frowned on.
We have another question. Is there a risk of inhalation of salmonella from cleaning coops, and can it make you sick if inhaled?
Correct. Yes, there is a risk. Salmonella survives, again, really well in dried fecal matter. It can survive for at least a month. And so yes, if you inhale it, you're probably going to swallow some of it. It's probably not going to infect your lungs, but it could get into your eyes, and then if your eyes water, it can get down your tear ducts and you can swallow it. So again, it's that risk of you're swallowing some of it and now it's in your stomach and potentially getting into your intestinal tract. So yeah, we'll get into
so with chicks, right? We would say more so with chicks. You'll go into later.
Yeah, I'll go into later what you can do if you're cleaning out an adult coop to lower that risk. Are there any other questions?
Okay. Nope, we're good.
I did see something in the Q&A. It is not a risk for COVID as far as I know, but there's still a lot we don't know about COVID. So I can't say authoritatively anything on that.
We have another question, sorry.
Yep.
If salmonella is in chicken poop, then why use for fertilizer in gardens?
That is a really good question. So if you properly fertilize, or if you properly compost your fertilizer, it actually gets hot enough to kill the salmonella. If you don't properly compost your chicken poop, then it is in fact a risk. The other option is to put raw fecal matter on your garden at the end of the growing season, and then the salmonella will die off over the winter. But you do not want to put fresh chicken poop on your garden when you're growing things, because that is definitely a risk for getting salmonella on your vegetables. All right, so I wanted to get some data from the Vermont Department of Health, specifically on Vermont. So I reached out to the Vermont Department of Health in 2019, and they graciously gave me data from 2016, and then I was able to get data the following year for 2020. There is no data recorded from last year because they were all reassigned to COVID. So we will see what 2022 looks like. But over the last 5 years, looking at the people who had recorded cases of salmonella, about 20% of them on average had exposure to live poultry. It can be a little bit difficult to figure out if it's live poultry or maybe it's a food you ate that gave you salmonella. But if you can't come up with something that you ate that was a likely culprit and you have exposure to live poultry is a good bet, and sometimes they'll actually test the birds and find salmonella. A really important thing to note is that looking at the people who got salmonella from live poultry, 30% of those cases were kids under the age of 10. So even though they weren't necessarily the majority of people getting sick, they represented a substantial portion of people getting sick from their birds, which isn't surprising because kids really like chickens and chicks, and it's really common to see them kissing or cuddling birds. And again, keep in mind that these cases are a fraction of what is probably actually happening. The underreporting multiplier is 29x. So if we just, for ease, multiply these numbers by 30, we're probably seeing close to 600 cases a year in Vermont of people getting sick off of their backyard poultry. And we don't have a very large population, so we're looking at somewhere around 0.5 to 1% of Vermonters getting sick from their backyard poultry every year, which is not great. So I'm not the only person to look at this problem. There was a study published in, I think, 2018 or 2019 from Boston. So the Massachusetts State Department of Health tested 53 flocks in the greater Boston area. So this would be a city area. Chickens would be primarily penned. And they only found 1 flock that had Salmonella. And as it turns out, Salmonella Kentucky isn't a major health risk. So that was really promising in terms of the safety of keeping backyard chickens. Unfortunately, Washington State followed up and published a paper, I think last year, and they tested a mix of urban and rural flocks in the counties around Seattle and actually found 1 out of 34 flocks was positive for Salmonella. And that flock had Salmonella that is dangerous to humans. So for our purposes, we wanted to look at Salmonella in Vermont, to look at adults, to look at babies, to look at if there were differences in towns versus in rural flocks, and to really tease apart these questions and see if we could get some better data. So we started this in 2019.
Andrea, I have
yes.
a couple questions, but I think they'd be relevant for later.
Okay.
We could do it now or later. What would you prefer?
Let me see what they are.
How do you sanitize the eggs, and then should we be washing? Remember
we'll get, yeah, we can cover that later. So this picture is myself and my grad student at the time, Melissa. And here we're swabbing a chicken's cloaca. This is one of the best ways to get information on whether an individual bird has Salmonella. If you take a sample of soil bedding from the flock, you can find out whether anyone in the flock has Salmonella. But if you actually want to figure out which bird it is, you do have to swab the individual bird. So we've done both at different times. I'm moving towards a primary approach of taking a bedding sample and then coming back and swabbing the birds if we find Salmonella, as this is a lot easier to orchestrate. So when we think about how we detect Salmonella, it's actually a bit of a complicated process. So we have either our swab or our bedding sample here. And the first thing we have to do is mix these with a broth to encourage the bacteria to grow. So we start with a broth that is essentially the equivalent of chicken soup for bacteria. It's nourishing, it's very comforting, and they grow really well. And this allows any bacteria present in the sample to grow. The next step, once we've kick-started things, is to start to select for Salmonella and against anything else present. And that's where these beautiful teal and green colored tubes come in. These allow Salmonella to grow, but most other things won't grow. And then finally, the last step is to streak out these tubes onto a plate that is supposed to only allow Salmonella to grow. It does allow closely related organisms to grow, so we often see E. coli because that's pretty similar to Salmonella. But salmonella on this looks like these black dots. And so this is a plate that has salmonella. This plate is mixed. There's some black, but there's also some yellow. And then this plate has mostly yellow and is probably not salmonella. So we look at these plates, we record the results, and then we run additional tests to confirm that we actually do have a salmonella. And then we save the samples to look at them in more depth later. So at this point, we have, well, at one point we had a whole freezer full of chicken bedding samples. At this point, we have a couple boxes of tubes of salmonella. So it turns out that the amount of salmonella you find in chickens is pretty variable. In 2019, we did not find any salmonella. We tested 28 flocks. It was a mix of urban and rural chickens, primarily in Chittenden County, and there was no salmonella. And I thought it seemed too good to be true because, like, there's got to be salmonella out there. I'm missing it. Sure enough, in 2020, we tested about half a dozen flocks, and we had one sample that popped positive for salmonella. So that was encouraging. We realized we could confirm that we could actually detect salmonella, and that did exist in Vermont. Last year, we tested flocks, I think somewhere between a dozen and 18 flocks, and we found 6 flocks that had salmonella in them. And so we see that it really varies by year, but one interesting thing that we found is that these are primarily rural flocks that have salmonella. In fact, 5 out of 7 of these flocks were either in a rural area or in a cluster of houses in a rural area. So when we thought about this a bit more, one of the things that came to mind is that rural chickens are more likely to be free range. Even if they're not officially free range, they're more likely to be let out of the yard or have a really big pen and potentially have access to wildlife and wild birds. And one of the things we know about salmonella is it lives in a lot of wild birds and a variety of wild animals, including rodents and reptiles and amphibians. So I think that is why we find more salmonella in rural birds compared to urban birds. But overall, what we see is if we look on an individual bird basis, only about 2% of all birds will have salmonella. But if we look at how many flocks have at least one bird that has salmonella, we see that almost 17% of flocks have one bird or more that has salmonella. Notably, it's usually only 1 or 2 birds out of a flock. It's usually not the entire flock. Okay. So after 2019, we knew we needed to do some more looking, and we began to wonder if maybe the salmonella was primarily in chicks instead of in adults. And as luck would have it, with COVID, it was hard to go to people's individual houses and swab their chickens. And I had an undergrad working with me who worked at an agricultural supply store. So she asked her boss gave her permission, and she collected about 56 samples from her store and froze them and brought them back with her when she came back to school. And this allowed us to get started on studying chicks and salmonella. We got 80 samples total in our first year, and only 1 of them had salmonella, which was interesting. It was a lot less salmonella than we expected. But we also knew that we only had 80 samples and that there was a lot more that we could look at. This past year, we collected 260 samples from, I think, 9 agricultural supply stores or hatcheries or farm stores across Vermont. Of these, 99 had salmonella. So a huge increase compared to last year. In fact, if you look at just last year's data, it seems that salmonella is really rare in chicks, If we combine it with this year's data, we see that about 30% of chicks between 2021 and or 2020 and 2021 had salmonella. And this year it was close to 40%. I'll get into NPIP and non-NPIP later, but suffice it to say that NPIP chicks should have had less salmonella, and I'll discuss the implications of that in a minute. We did collect samples from breeds other than chickens. So one of the interesting things one of my students just figured out this weekend is that actually salmonella is more common in meat bird chicks than in laying hen chicks. So I'm not entirely sure of the reasons for that, but it is something to be aware of. Turkeys had the highest positivity rate. 50% of our turkey samples had salmonella, and only 9% of the duck samples had salmonella, but we didn't have a ton of duck samples. So I wouldn't put too much weight on that yet. We did not have enough quail or geese samples to be able to say anything because we had fewer than 5 of each. All right, so let's put this all in context. What does this mean for the average chicken owner? What it means is that your chicks are a much bigger risk for giving you salmonella than your adult birds. And this is actually something that CDC study I mentioned earlier by Basler and his co-authors had also found. When they looked at investigations of salmonellosis that people got from chickens, 65% of them had interacted with only chicks. So it does seem that chicks are more likely to have salmonella overall. The Michigan State Department of Health ran a study very similar to ours a few years ago, and they found that 26% of shipments over a 3-year period had salmonella. So we are finding more salmonella than the Michigan State Department of Health did, but we'll have to see what this year's numbers look like, because this year could be better for salmonella. We don't know yet. It's an adventure. Importantly, in the Michigan State Department of Health study, we do see that the salmonella they found actually matched. It was the same type of salmonella they were seeing in outbreaks, which confirms that people were actually getting sick off of these chicks that were arriving in these egg supply stores. And we do expect to find similar results when we sequence our own salmonella from the chicks, but we haven't completed that yet. Overall, we see that salmonella is present in 20 to 74% of chick shipments from commercial hatcheries in Vermont. And I'm defining a chick shipment as a section of this 4-section box because we take the pads and we test that. Each of those sections usually holds 25 chicks, a slightly smaller number of turkeys or ducks. So that means that in each one of these sections, there's a potential that could infect multiple people, because most people don't buy 25 chicks at a pop from an agricultural supply store. I will caveat that we don't know that every single chicken there has it, but they are going to be pretty smushed together in transit, and the likelihood that they're giving it to each other is extremely high. So I would say probably by the time they arrive at an agricultural supply store, they've all definitely been exposed, and probably most of them have contracted it. Okay, so I promised you we'd talk about NPIP. And this is actually something that is quite important. In 2020, one of the reasons we thought we found a lot less salmonella is that the stores that my undergrad Kata was getting her samples from all purchased from hatcheries participating in NPIP programs. NPIP is a program run by the USDA. Actually, it's a boutique of programs. Some of these are mandatory, some of these are voluntary for hatcheries, and they're meant to either eliminate or reduce the presence of different pathogens in chicks. So the mandatory program for all states in the US is that the chicks cannot contain Salmonella pullorum or Salmonella typhoid. Pullorum is very deadly for chickens and typhoid is very deadly for humans. So they will not allow chicks to be sold across state lines if they have not been confirmed to be free of these two types of Salmonella. And that is the symbol for Salmonella pullorum typhoid free. The optional programs are then avian influenza free, which means that they confirm that their birds do not have avian influenza of any type, and Salmonella monitored. Salmonella monitored is, I think, one of the rarer ones. Avian influenza seems to be a bit more common in hatcheries. Salmonella monitored, importantly, does not mean that your chicks are not allowed to have Salmonella. It just means they test for it regularly and keep track of the levels and are supposed to take action to reduce them. And this is the symbol for Salmonella monitored. So we were able to get information on the individual hatcheries from the stores we sampled at. And if we look at the breakdown of NPIP Salmonella monitored hatcheries and non-Salmonella monitored hatcheries, we see there is a really huge amount of variation. Town Line Hatchery, which does not do Salmonella monitoring through NPIP, was 20% positive for Salmonella. Ridgeway, which also does not do Salmonella monitoring, had 57% of samples being positive for Salmonella. If we look at Mount Healthy, which is a huge supplier in Vermont, we see that about 41% of samples had Salmonella. There was some variation depending on which store we were collecting samples from, but the average was 41%. And then Hoover's Hatchery distinguished itself by being the absolute worst. Both stores that purchased from Hoover's had rates in the 70s, with an average across both stores of 74% of our samples were coming back positive for Salmonella. So not good. I don't know what is going on with Hoover's, but it's not good. So I actually ended up talking to some of the national NPIP folks, and what they told me is that NPIP Salmonella monitoring is administered on a state-by-state level or basis. There's a representative for each state that oversees that program and is supposed to enforce it. What I think is happening currently is that everybody's overwhelmed with COVID. The demand for chicks has gone up and the enforcement has gone down due to COVID. I am trying to get a hold of some of the NPIP folks for some of the states where Hoover's, Mount Healthy, Ridgeway, and Town Line are located to see if I can get some answers. Are there questions, Nicole?
Yeah, I just want to mention that it's the state they come from that tests, not Vermont when they come here.
That's a great clarification.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if your hatchery is located in Ohio, Ohio runs the program. If it's in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania runs the program. And they're supposed to follow up with the hatcheries because they're supposed to test, I think, 8 times a year for Salmonella if the hatchery is involved in the Salmonella monitoring program. But clearly something wasn't going well last year. So if you see all of these on a hatchery website, that's a good indicator they are an NPIP participant. But it's a little, and do Salmonella monitoring, but it's a little more complicated because they sometimes only Salmonella monitor certain breeds. So it's a bit tricky. All right. So the takeaways, I would say, are that the individual adult chickens are not very likely to have Salmonella. But if we look at any given flock, the likelihood that at least one bird has Salmonella is about 16%. Bigger concern is that there's really no way to tell visually if your chicken has Salmonella. So they usually seem completely healthy, If you see lash eggs, it can be an indicator of a bacterial infection, which could be Salmonella, but you can't be sure it's Salmonella. Prolapsed vents, there was one flock we tested where like 4 of the birds had prolapsed vents, but none of those birds were positive for Salmonella. And then the ones that seemed completely healthy were positive for Salmonella. So you can't know which birds might be carrying Salmonella. The good news is if they acquire Salmonella as an adult, they'll probably recover from it pretty quickly. The bad news is if they acquire Salmonella as a chick, there was a study run in the 90s where they gave, I think, leghorn chicks Salmonella as babies, and half of them were still had Salmonella in their feces when they started laying. So if they get Salmonella as a chick, they may not get over it, I guess.
Question for you.
Yeah.
So is it better to get older chicks versus newborn chicks?
Well, I mean, it depends where your chicks are coming from. If your chicks are still coming from the hatchery, they probably still have Salmonella, even if they're 4 weeks old versus a day old.
Right.
Overall, we see that about 30% of chicks from these large hatcheries do have Salmonella. It seems like purchasing smaller and more locally, we found less Salmonella, but we don't have as many samples from that, so we can't be 100% sure. But if you do buy from an agricultural supply store or buy from a commercial hatchery, you should probably assume that at least some of your chicks have Salmonella and use caution accordingly. Specifically, try to reduce exposure to their feces, to their bedding. Again, be careful about cleaning out their water containers and their feed containers, anywhere where you might then be washing dishes or food. So a bathtub is going to be a better choice for cleaning that out, or a utility sink, than your kitchen sink or your bathroom sink. The CDC has spent a lot of time thinking about how people can reduce risk. They draw a slightly harder line on this than I necessarily would, but some of the really good recommendations are really fairly straightforward. Wash hands after handling poultry or their equipment or collecting their eggs, because, you know, the eggs are passed through the cloaca and so is the poop. So even if the egg looks clean, it could still have some Salmonella on the exterior. You can't see Salmonella with the naked eye. There can be a lot of Salmonella in a very small amount of liquid, or, you know, it's not colorful, it's not translucent naturally. You can't see it. As I've said previously, it's best to avoid kissing chickens simply because of the fact that they dust bathe, they lay in their feces, all of that. And you're putting that then directly in your face and on your mouth, which is really a very good way to get Salmonella. It's also a really good practice to not wear the same shoes inside the house that you wear inside your coop. So to have dedicated farm shoes or coop shoes if you live in town, especially if you have kids, and even more especially if you have kids that are still at the stage where they're crawling around on the floor. If you start walking indoors with shoes that have been in the chicken coop, there's a possibility that you're now spreading that Salmonella around on your floor. And if you've got a kid crawling around on the floor and sticking their hands all over their face, they could then get Salmonella from that. And that's actually happened with other bacteria. A number of years ago, there was a cow farmer who walked inside with his boots and his kid got sick with virulent E. coli from that. That was the only exposure they could figure out. So it is something to be aware of.
I have a couple questions for you. A bunch, actually. So but if it's coming in from the eggs, then that would mean some egg providers' hens are really infected in order for it to end up in the eggs.
Yeah. So if the hatcheries breeder flocks that are laying the eggs have Salmonella, then yes, it can be on the inside of the egg and the chicks can be born with salmonella. So your conclusion is absolutely 100% correct.
Okay. And then what about chicks from stores? And if salmonella, then what do you do?
I mean, if you get a chick from an agricultural supply store, any of the big chains in Vermont, it's possible they have salmonella. It's actually reasonably likely. There's that 1 in 3 chance. If you assume they have salmonella and keep them out of your kitchen and supervise kids around them and, don't minimize contact with them, you'll probably be fine. And they probably, that study I mentioned, once the chickens started laying, I think almost none of them or none of them were laying eggs with salmonella on the inside. They still had it in their poop, but it was not inside the egg. So it's pretty rare, even if a chicken has salmonella, that it gets into the ovaries. I'm not entirely sure why we're seeing so many chicks being born with salmonella from the hatcheries. It's probably in the parent flocks. Well, it's definitely in the parent flocks. They may also not be cleaning their equipment well enough between hatches. And so the chicks could be acquiring it from the incubator or the brooders as well.
Right. I think it's just good practices, washing your hands,
Yeah.
things like that. Someone asked about washing the eggs, which we'll go into later.
Yep.
And then someone else asked if we can test our own flocks, like a at-home kit.
I wish.
To somewhere. Can we send a test somewhere?
So you could get a veterinarian to test. It's probably going to be pretty expensive. If you're in Vermont or New England, I do accept mail-in samples of bedding, and I'll put up the information on that at the end. And then we test and we give you the results. Because it's an ongoing research project, that would be free to you. One day, maybe we will have like antigen tests for salmonella like we do for COVID, but we don't yet. I think that would be super cool if we had those, but I'm afraid there's not a huge market for it and it's not been developed. Okay. All right, so thinking about other things you can do, if you're cleaning a coop, especially if it's dusty, but really just in general, there tends to be a lot of dust that's generated by cleaning. So it is a really good idea to wear a mask and maybe glasses, because if that's all flying into your face and your eyes, it's then, maybe you're tearing up a little bit and it's traveling down your tear ducts and into your throat and you're swallowing it. Yeah, so wearing a mask, which we all now have many of thanks to COVID, is a good practice for when you're cleaning your coop. Especially when you get new birds, but annually minimum otherwise, it's a good idea to clean out and then sanitize your coop. So most sanitizers will not work unless you get rid of the buildup. So any dried on manure, any dust, any dirt, you want to clean it out pretty thoroughly and have it pretty clean for your sanitizer to have the best shot at working. Nicolle can give some examples of good sanitizers for chicken coops. Bleach and vinegar are options, but you do want to make sure things dry out and there's not a strong smell when you get your birds in there. But definitely between flocks, if your flock dies off and you bring in new ones, you need to clean and sanitize the coop so you're not passing diseases between your old flock and your new one. Nicolle, do you have anything to add to that?
I just put some sanitizers I use.
Cool.
But there's a lot out there. People could just ask, but you want something that's safe as well for chickens, or for your birds, or you let it dry completely before you have them. If it's not safe for birds, you want to make sure you have it dry completely.
Yeah, for sure. So you've probably heard a lot about this in regard to the avian influenza, but this is also true for salmonella. As much as possible, keep wild birds away from your birds. If you have bird feeders for songbirds, make sure those are not located in or near your chicken coop or your chicken pen, because songbirds do carry salmonella. Actually, last year there was an outbreak of salmonella in people who had songbird feeders, and I guess when they were cleaning the feeders, they got themselves infected with salmonella from the songbirds. So keep wild birds away from your birds. So the CDC has gone back and forth on cleaning eggs and the best way to do that. The current recommendation is actually not to wash your eggs, but to use sandpaper if there's fine grade sandpaper if there's a lot of dried on stuff on them. The other option is to wash the eggs right before you use them. So, and that's personally what I do if I get eggs from someone and they're dirty. So I also think it's a good practice to then, if you're like if you're baking and you're breaking the eggs, then once you've broken the eggs and added them to the dish, to then go wash your hands before you keep cooking, just so you're not spreading stuff around the kitchen. Again, because eggs can occasionally have salmonella on the inside, it's best practice to refrigerate them. I know that Europe tends to not refrigerate their eggs. So it is one of those things that it's not 100% settled science, but if you refrigerate your eggs and they have salmonella on the inside, the salmonella will not grow if your refrigerator is the right temperature. If you leave your eggs on the counter and they have salmonella inside them, the salmonella will grow very well. So, especially if you like to do any eggs on the side of undercooked, you definitely want to refrigerate them to try to minimize the amount of salmonella you have in them.
So, a question for you. So, should we wash our eggs and then refrigerate them, or not wash them, put them in a container and refrigerate them?
I would not wash them and put them in the refrigerator. And then if you need to wash them before you break them and use them, then you can wash them then. You know.
I have another question. Is there a vaccine for salmonella?
So one of the reasons we don't actually have a vaccine that works for salmonella is that there are so many types. There are a couple of vaccines for certain types of salmonella that are primarily used in the meat bird industry. I don't think they're available commercially to backyard owners. But those only cover 1 or 2 different types of salmonella, and there's 20 of them that we could be concerned about. So it's not a great strategy or a very viable strategy for the industry to pursue. The large poultry industry farmers have looked at different things, including giving the chicks probiotics and such, but I don't know the formulation of that, so I wouldn't rush out and give your chickens yogurt. It might not be a good idea. I'm not sure how that would affect chicks. All right, so I don't want to scare anyone away from getting chickens or having chickens or enjoying chickens. They're really fun, and I think you should definitely have the birds and enjoy them. And the eggs are definitely better when raised on a homestead or a small farm. It's more an issue of being aware of the risk and taking steps to reduce the risk. So just the simple things of not kissing chickens, of washing your hands scrupulously, of having different shoes indoors and out, and of keeping kids from kissing chickens and chicks, those can really reduce your risk a lot. However, if you are in a category where you're more at risk for severe illness from salmonella, you should probably be a little extra careful. And these categories are defined by the CDC as kids under 6, people over the age of 65. I know that's not very old, but there's actually statistical data that after age 65, the immune system becomes a lot less effective. Immunocompromised persons, obviously HIV is a concern, but also diabetes can be a concern. Anyone on immunosuppressant drugs for an organ transplant or autoimmune disease is going to be at higher risk. And then pregnant women are at somewhat higher risk as well because the immune system is actually turned down a bit to avoid attacking the fetus in utero. So again, don't kiss chicks or chickens. Try to keep kids from kissing them. Maybe don't let them cuddle the chickens in their pajamas. Have different shoes indoors and out, lots of hand washing, and wearing a mask when you clean the coop is a great way to avoid a face full of salmonella.
I'd say too, for the kids, I know kids love to help with the chicks. Maybe the parents could do the changing of the bedding, the cleaning, and the kids could do the food and the water.
Yeah, for sure. So like definitely get kids involved. It's a great learning experience. Let's maybe scale it so they're not directly dealing with feces, especially under the age of 6.
I have some questions for you. One about eggs and washing. Is there something specific you wash your eggs with?
No, it's kind of risky to use detergents because you could accidentally end up with some of that getting through the porous shell. So you really just want to do lukewarm, well, water that's the same temperature as the egg, essentially. So if it's an egg at room temperature, lukewarm water. If it's an egg in the refrigerator, maybe colder water. Okay, another question. Do you see salmonella in lamb or goat or other animals? Oh yes, it's basically everywhere. I have historically done this program called Skype a Scientist, and one of the classes, I think it was 2nd or 3rd graders, decided that it was fun to ask me about every species they could think of. And as it turns out, if you're madly Googling this so you can answer 2nd graders' questions, you will find that basically any species of animal can acquire salmonella and potentially get sick from it.
A question about washing eggs with dish soap, and I think you answered that already with no.
Yeah.
Because it goes in, it's porous.
Yes.
The shell is porous.
Yeah. All right, other questions. I'm happy to answer more questions. I will say I keep a blog. The link is on the slide. I can put that in the chat. And this has updates on the chicken project so that you can keep abreast of it and what we find and see if things change next year. I do see a question about how you get poop off. Again, if it's dry, you can use fine grade sandpaper, or you could wash it right before you use it. Nicole's putting some things in the chat. Nicole's website is Sugar Feather Farm. She has a Facebook page as well, and she sells lovely birds. So you should check her out if you are interested in expanding your flock, especially if you live near Vermont. But I think she ships as well.
I do. Yes, all over the US. And then I have on my website under blog, I have 2 articles on salmonella, one that we did, and then another one on the Salmonella pylori. I tried to post the links. Sorry, it's not working, but all you have to do is go to my main website, upper, just hit blog, and then I have my blog articles right there.
And if you are interested in getting your chickens tested, there is a page on my blog. If you go to the, I'll just copy it, where it talks about what you can do to get your chickens tested. You're always definitely free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions. We do adults and we do chickens, and this year we are also testing for Campylobacter, which is another bacterium that can infect chickens. People tend to be less familiar with it, but it's still a pretty big problem. So
Can you tell them what Campylobacter is?
Yeah, so Campylobacter is actually considered a commensal with chickens, as in it doesn't get them sick at all. It's extremely contagious. It will infect the entire flock if one of the birds has salmonella. And generally for humans, it causes mild diarrhea, but sometimes it can lead to really bad complications, including temporary paralysis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and a number of other nasty side effects. So it can make people really sick. It's rarely tested for because it is not as well known, but it is a concern. And it is definitely causing illness in Vermont per Vermont Department of Health data. I'll just add, if you weren't here at the beginning, the state veterinarians asked me to pass on this message about high pathogenicity avian influenza. And there are links in the chat, though I guess if you're here early, you probably won't be able to access them. So I'll repost those.
Just a thing about the bird feeders. So,
Yeah.
So also having bird feeders, wild birds just carry unfortunately, a lot of disease. So avian influenza and salmonella and probably a slew of other things. So just really try to keep those bird feeders away from your chicken yards.
Yep.
I wouldn't even have them if you can. I know it's really nice.
Well, certainly if you have your chickens free ranging, it's not a good idea.
Correct. Yeah. Right.